Sasha, how's it going?
Good morning, Bremer. How are you?
Yeah, I'm going well, thanks, Sash. Have you got any time to talk about coffee processing?
Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna finish this espresso and we'll get straight into it. What are we talking about today?
Well, can you explain to me what wash process coffee is?
Wash process. So, absolutely. That's for you. There we go.
Thank you.
Nice. So, wash process. It's delicious. So, wash process is a most popular process when it comes to coffee fermentation. So, let's look at this coffee tree and let's have imaginary coffee cherry. So, when we take the coffee cherry and we pulp it, we can pulp it by using our hands. So, we take the skin off. And what we end up with is two seeds. Most of the time, two seeds. We have one seed and we can also have three seeds. So this is the very first step of wash process coffees, by removing the skin from the fruit and also having the seeds that are completely separated. Now we can do a few different ways of wash processing. First one is dry fermentation, second one is wet fermentation, and also the final one is mechanically demucilaged fermentation.
Would you be able to dive deeper into what dry fermentation is?
Dry fermentation? Sure. Just gonna go back to my station. So dry fermentation is, what it is we have two seeds and we place them in different containers, without water, without anything. These containers, they can look like a big swimming pools, or they can be as small as a 100-liter buckets. And coffee is fermented there up until it's, all of the mucilage, all of the sugars are completely removed from the seed, and then they take into next step of drying. So it's a very, very simple way to do fermenting coffees.
I guess temperature would then play a big part within that fermentation process then.
Yeah, I think that's the most critical and most crucial part of fermenting wash process or dry fermented coffees. The reason why is all of the coffees are fermented in outdoor condition traditionally, and when we ferment coffees, we obviously bringing or degrading the sugars, bring them to yeast as well as the bacteria. So it's a really, really important to have very stable temperature. Most of the time in most of the farms is during the day it might be 22, 23 degrees, and then during the night temperatures will drop to 10 to 12 degrees. And what's happening in these changes of the temperatures, we are attracting different bacteria and different yeast. So the goal is to have the environment where we are fermenting the coffee in a more stable temperature as possible.
Well, how would you know the fermentation is completed then?
So up until maybe 10 years ago, what farmers would do is they would put their hand in this fermentation tank and they would sort of feel the coffee seeds. And if they feel, I guess, not slimy or not sticky, and if they feel really dry, imagine like putting the marbles in your hand and they're sort of scratching. For them, that meant that coffee is fermented. But it's not very consistent way when it comes down to taste of the coffee, because as I mentioned earlier, we might be fermenting coffee for 24 hours at 20 degrees, and following time or following day it might be 28 degrees. And if you're fermenting that coffee for 24 hours, these coffees will taste very different. So it's important to have a more modern tools, and where we can test the Brix meter, for example, which is content of the sugars before fermentation, at the end of the fermentation. But in the same time, we should also be testing the pH. Because pH normal would be, when we start fermentation, 5.5, and then it will continuously keep decreasing up until that critical point where coffee is over-fermented. And critical point means that when coffee is over-fermented, it will taste sour, it will have no sugars, it will taste almost like balsamic vinegar and salty. And to the extreme, they can also taste like phenolic.
So talking about flavor, what kind of coffee would you expect this to be? Would it be a filter, espresso, or maybe even a milk-based coffee?
So most of the dry fermentation coffees, when we talking about milk-based blends, at least in our coffee, and if we want to have that component of sort of wash coffee in the mill-based blend, we would always try to encourage dry fermentation coffees. The reason why is dry fermentation coffees are normally a lot sweeter than other wash processes, and they have a lot more body. So obviously with the milk-based coffees, we want that sweetness and we want that body to be as high as possible so you can balance it with the milk and it's not tasting milk dominant. But in the same time, if we have a particular varietal that has naturally a little bit more acidity and then sweetness, when we're doing a dry fermentation coffees, we can really bring that sweetness up and to make sure that we can have that more harmonious balance. So it does depend on the coffee itself and what do we need to increase or decrease, and it also depends on how we want to use it. This particular espresso is dry fermented and it's beautiful, sweet, round. And I found that, for example, with a lot of espresso coffees with dry fermentation, it's more to do with the texture, with the sweetness, with the body, and not necessarily that much with the sort of flavors and acidity.
Awesome. So where can we find out more about the different types of coffee fermentation and processing?
So when we talk next, Bremer, so feel free to find me somewhere in the warehouse, and looking forward to talking to you more about the mucilage process, and also we can talk a little bit more about the wet process or wet fermentation as well. Thank you.